This is the SM Podcast Show, where the love of Christ continues to grow. Lift your heart, let His presence glow. Together we rise, together we know. The SM Podcast Show.
Hey everyone, glad to have you here with us on the ESM Podcast Show. We've got a truly jarring story making headlines out of Canada, something that sparked a massive outcry and really raised questions about fundamental freedoms. We're talking about a pastor who's actually been jailed for refusing to apologize for protesting a drag queen story hour. Can you walk us through the initial details of what happened here? It sounds pretty intense.
Absolutely. It's a very tense situation. So, the core of this story revolves around Pastor Derek Reimer. He was arrested in Calgary, Alberta just this past Wednesday. And the reason for his arrest is quite specific. He refused a court order to write and sign an apology. This apology was meant for the manager of the Calgary Public Library, stemming from a protest he led 2 years ago, back in 2023. At that time, he was protesting a Reading with Royalty event, which featured male drag queens reading to children. He simply stated he felt he had nothing to apologize for, and that defiance led directly to his arrest this week.
Wow, so he was essentially jailed for standing by his convictions and refusing to say he was sorry. That's a powerful stance. And another Canadian pastor, Artur Pawlowski, has been very vocal about this, calling the authorities minions of Satan. Can you tell us more about his reaction and why he's using such strong language?
Pawlowski's reaction has been incredibly strong, and he hasn't minced words at all. He expressed his outrage directly to the Christian Post, saying things like, "These people are sick in the head, they're demon-possessed, they're wicked, evil minions of Satan." He said this while he was actually in court in Calgary, showing support for Pastor Reimer during his bail hearing. For Pawlowski, this isn't just about a simple protest or a legal disagreement. He views it as a deeply spiritual battle, an attack on fundamental Christian values, and a manifestation of evil forces at play. His language really underscores the gravity with which he perceives this situation.
That context is really important. So this isn't just a spontaneous incident, it's part of a larger ongoing conflict. You mentioned the 2023 protest. Can you elaborate on what happened then, what the specific charges were against Reimer, and how this court order came about?
Certainly. Back in 2023, Pastor Reimer was quite active in protesting these Reading with Royalty events. He was actually arrested multiple times that year and even spent Easter weekend behind bars because of his protests. The charges at the time stemmed from him allegedly violating a municipal bylaw that had been passed that same year. This bylaw prohibited protests within 100 meters of a recreation facility or a library entrance. So, his continued presence and vocal opposition at these events led to legal actions against him, which eventually culminated in a court order that included, among other things, this demand for an apology. The Calgary Police Service actually confirmed that his latest arrest was for probation-issued warrants for breach of a conditional sentence order from a criminal harassment charge, which means he was already under some form of judicial supervision from those earlier incidents.
So this isn't his first run-in with the law over these issues, which gives us even more perspective. And I saw some of the footage of his recent arrest, which went viral. He was asking the officers, "Are you the feelings police?" What's the significance of that, and how does it play into the broader narrative here?
That line, "Are you the feelings police?" really resonated with a lot of people and became a key part of the viral footage. It speaks to a sentiment among some that authorities are overreaching, not just in enforcing laws, but in dictating what people can say or even feel, especially regarding sensitive cultural issues. From Reimer's perspective, he wasn't committing a violent crime, he was expressing a deeply held belief. So asking if they were the feelings police was a rhetorical challenge, suggesting that the state was trying to compel his internal thoughts or emotional responses rather than simply dealing with outward actions. It highlights the perceived tension between freedom of expression and what he sees as an attempt to silence dissenting views on moral and social issues.
It really does underscore that tension. Now, Pastor Pawlowski, who's been so outspoken, has his own history of clashes with Canadian authorities, particularly during the COVID-19 lockdowns. He kept his church open despite court orders. How does his personal experience color his view of what's happening to Pastor Reimer?
His personal experience is absolutely central to his perspective on Reimer's situation. Pawlowski has had repeated run-ins with Canadian authorities, even being arrested multiple times and serving jail time for defying lockdown orders to keep his church open during the pandemic. He describes himself as the canary in the coal mine, saying he was yelling and screaming, "Listen, they're doing this to me. Be sure of it. They're going to come after you as well." He sees Reimer's treatment as a direct continuation of what he experienced, a pattern of the government trying to instill fear and silence any opposition. Pawlowski has even alleged mistreatment during his own incarceration, claiming he was abused, shoved in a small cage, and placed in a psychiatric ward after delivering a sermon to truckers protesting vaccine mandates. So for him, Reimer's arrest is not an isolated event, but rather a systemic effort to suppress dissent and religious freedom in Canada.
That's quite a powerful parallel he's drawing. And you mentioned the court ordering Reimer to apologize. Pawlowski has also faced what he calls compelled speech, like being ordered to recite a specific script about COVID-19 and vaccines from the pulpit. How does this idea of compelled speech fit into both their stories and the broader legal landscape in Canada?
Compelled speech is a huge theme connecting both pastors' experiences and is a major point of contention. Pawlowski famously defied a provincial judge's order in 2021 to recite a script parroting the prevailing medical experts' opinions on COVID and vaccines whenever he spoke publicly on those topics. He viewed it as an egregious violation of his freedom of speech and conscience, arguing that the government shouldn't dictate what a pastor can say from his pulpit. The demand for Pastor Reimer to write and sign an apology falls squarely into this category of compelled speech. It's not just about stopping a specific action, but forcing an individual to express regret for beliefs they still hold. Both pastors see this as a dangerous precedent, where the state tries to control not just behavior, but thought and expression, which they argue is deeply concerning for a free and democratic society.
It certainly sounds like a very slippery slope in terms of free expression. Pawlowski also brought up Bill C-9, which he claims would criminalize the Bible. Can you shed some light on what that legislation is and why Christian groups are so concerned about it?
This is another significant concern that Pawlowski highlights as part of the broader legislative trend in Canada. Bill C-9, as he mentions, is a piece of legislation that Christian groups are very worried about because it would effectively remove a religious exemption from the country's hate speech law. The concern is that without this exemption, traditional biblical teachings, especially those pertaining to marriage, gender, and sexuality, could be interpreted as hate speech under the law. This would potentially pave the way for prosecutions against individuals or organizations who hold and express these long-standing religious beliefs. Pawlowski views Derek Reimer's situation as a stark example and a warning of how this kind of legislation could be enforced, targeting religious individuals who speak out on these sensitive topics. He believes it represents a direct attack on the freedom to practice and preach one's faith.
So we're not just talking about individual incidents, but a legislative push that could have widespread implications for religious expression. Pawlowski also frames Reimer's situation within a much wider context, describing it as a demonic agenda being pushed globally, particularly regarding children and sexual morality. He even drew comparisons to the Soviet regime he grew up under. That's a very strong statement. Can you elaborate on his broader analysis?
He absolutely places this within a massive, almost apocalyptic global framework. Pawlowski is deeply concerned about what he perceives as a push throughout the Western world for sexual immorality and debauching children. He views this as a sick, demonic, from the pit of hell agenda being forwarded by globalists. His comparison to the Soviet regime he experienced in communist Poland is particularly striking. He understands firsthand how totalitarian systems try to control populations, and he sees parallels in what he believes is an effort to indoctrinate the youth. He even quotes Adolf Hitler, saying, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future," to emphasize the strategic importance of influencing young people. For Pawlowski, figures like Derek Reimer who stand against this agenda are seen as existential threats to those pushing it. And that's why he believes they are being targeted so aggressively. He truly believes this is a battle for the soul of society.
That really adds a profound layer to this story, framing it as more than just a legal dispute, but a battle of worldviews and ideologies. What do you think Pawlowski means when he says figures like Reimer are a threat to these plans and that truth sets the captives free?
For Pawlowski, the threat that people like Reimer pose is rooted in their willingness to speak out and expose what he considers to be the truth. He believes that those pushing this agenda thrive in the shadows and through manipulation. As he puts it, the worst thing for those tyrants, wannabe pharaohs as I call them, is exposure. If you keep your mouth shut, you're okay. The moment you expose them, suddenly they're terrified, they're afraid, because truth sets the captives free. In his view, simply speaking what they believe to be true, especially against what he sees as moral corruption, is revolutionary. He says, they hate the truth. And who hates the truth? Who calls the truth hate? Those who hate the truth. To them, it's hateful. It's a very clear call to action for others to find their voice and not be intimidated, because he believes that only through openly declaring the truth can society be liberated from these perceived dark forces. It's a powerful and deeply felt message for sure. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
This is the ESM Podcast Show, where the love of Christ continues to grow. Lift your heart, let His presence glow. Together we rise, together we